Hello, everyone. It's Kate Stillman with the Yoga Healer podcast, and I'm here with Ralph Moss, PhD, who has a book on Cancer Incorporated and has been writing a lot about alternative and complementary cancer treatments. And so we're going to have a deep dive discussion into your body of work, of decades of work around what's happened with cancer, with the industry around cancer, and your work in immunotherapy. So where would you like to begin?
Well, I can talk a little bit about how I got involved in this field. It's quite different than most people in that I didn't set out in any way to treat people with cancer. I didn't have a medical degree, medical background. On the other hand, when I started out, I wasn't a cancer patient. I was hired as the science writer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in 1974. And shortly after that, I had some life-changing experiences. I went to interview a scientist named Kanematsu Sugiura, who was the oldest researcher at Sloan Kettering, both in terms of his tenure there and in terms of his age. He was in his early 80s at that time. And in the course of the interview, he explained to me that he was working on a project concerning Laetrile or amygdalin. And I was very astonished by this because I was in public affairs department, and we had a statement that we gave out saying that Laetrile, which was a drug derived from apricot kernels, that this was basically quackery. I mean, we didn't use that word, but that's essentially what we were saying. So I couldn't understand why this distinguished scientist, would be researching this topic. And he showed me his lab books and his notes and his experiments, basically demonstrating that Laetrile could stop or slow the growth of tumors in mice, but more importantly, it could stop the spread of cancer. In those mice, the normal control animals got about 10 to 20% of the animals got lung secondary growths in the lung. And in the test animals, only about, excuse me, I think I got that wrong. So about 80% of the control animals would get secondary growths, metastases to the lung. And in the Laetrile treated animals, only 10 to 20% developed metastases. And he repeated this experiment several times because the results were so unexpected and contrary to what the rest of the scientific world was saying about this very controversial treatment. And it always came out the same. And he repeated it in other animal systems and in leukemia and in a couple of breast cancer models. So I think all in all, there were 6 or 7 tests that he performed alone or with other people, showing this very, very positive effect. And some other people had or claimed to have negative results as well, but he was world famous for the meticulousness of his methods going back to the 1920s. He was a world famous laboratory scientist, and who developed a lot of these techniques that other people used. So it was hard not to believe him. Plus, he was extremely persuasive in a very quiet and unassuming way, but you knew that there was no BS there. It was completely honest and probably true. So that was interesting, and I took that back to my boss, and we discussed that, and he asked me to continue keeping in touch with Dr. Sugiura, which I did. The interesting part was that as his experiments continued and as they became more and more positive, the statements coming from the leaders of our institution became more and more negative. And finally, in about 1976, one of the vice presidents of Sloan Kettering said, we have found Laetrile or amygdalin negative in all the animal systems we have tested. So this was an outright lie. And this
Was he citing research on that or not?
No, he was not citing research, and there was no such research. We, meaning Sloan Kettering, had overwhelmingly found it to be positive, but there were some equivocal tests. There was one group that didn't reproduce the results, and there was one group that claimed not to reproduce the results. When I inquired further into this, it turned out that they had given 1/40th of the dose of what Segura had given, 1/40th. And then they, on the basis of that, they claimed that this was negative. The person who announced this, who said this, was his own son-in-law, Schmidt. When I called Schmidt to ask him about this, I managed to get the question out, and he knew I was from our own public affairs department. He hung up on me, never answered the phone after that. And Segura stuck by his guns, and basically refused to back down. And they told, since he was coming into work every day, they told him at the end he couldn't work anymore if he continued to make statements about Laetrile. So they basically shut him up. And as for me, I wrote the official press release condemning Laetrile, but a few months later, I came out with a counter statement, a report of about 35 pages, basically blowing my own press release out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
So as my son said to me at the time, you can't go on working for them and against them forever. So I had to take a stand, and I did. And of course, they fired me. On the next business day, the New York Times said I had failed to carry out my most basic job responsibility.
How old were your kids at the time?
Ben was 10 at the time, and my daughter was 12. My wife was not working at that time. We had, I think, a total of $2,000 in the bank, which wasn't bad for a junior employee, but what wasn't enough to live on. And I didn't have any income for the next 4 years.
So you had your integrity, but not your job.
Correct. I felt very good about myself, but that's about where it ended. And other crazy stuff started to happen, like they denied my unemployment on the grounds that I had fired myself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure they're up to. So now let's fast forward to now. You have all these Moss reports on every type of cancer, documentaries. You've got books on Cancer Incorporated. So can you paint in like really broad strokes an overview of how you see the cancer industry?
Sure. So you can look at this in a number of different ways, depending on where you focus, where you cast your glance. So on the one hand, you have all these dedicated researchers who have made a lot of really wonderful discoveries in the past 50 years. It'll be December was the launching of the War on Cancer, 1971. So we're light years ahead of where we were in terms of our understanding of cancer. We could quibble about which of those discoveries are going to be the most fruitful, but certainly the billions of dollars that have been poured into it have really opened up our eyes in terms of many aspects of the cancer problem that were glimpsed 50 years ago, but not really well understood. And so you have that is the very positive thing. And the statistics, basically, they've improved in terms of cancer mortality and cancer occurrence of cancer. Some of that is just due to the fact that the medical system has improved. I mean, you see these old movies where people are dying of heart attacks and they don't even have them connected to oxygen, So, it's shocking sometimes what you see in these old movies or film or, YouTube videos or whatever. So we've made great progress in medicine and keeping people alive, basically. And I think that does trickle down to cancer. I think what's less impressive, far less impressive, is the actual benefit of the drugs that are approved for the treatment of advanced cancers, and particularly chemotherapy. So with chemotherapy, you've had some big advances. The childhood cancers was a tragic situation that's much improved today. The pediatric leukemias and so forth. And then for breast cancer and colon cancer and some other high risk cancers, if the person is at a high risk of recurrence after surgery, like if there are lymph node involvement or other signs of aggressiveness on the part of the cancer, chemotherapy can be used in those situations to make their outcome much more similar to that of a person with a less risky cancer. So this is important, and it can be, maybe I'll just throw out a figure, that in a high risk breast cancer, the chances of being alive 10 or 15 years later can be like 10% greater if you take the chemo and the hormonal therapy than if you don't. So that's a lot of people being alive at a certain point. And I have to emphasize this because I wrote the book Questioning Chemotherapy. Some people say, that I'm the person who destroyed chemo or denied chemo. I don't know what word you want to apply. In other words, I'm a critic of chemotherapy, and with good reason, because chemotherapy is also very toxic, potentially, very destructive of the person. And in advanced stage 4 cancers, it's not very effective. And so this became, when I wrote,
because the body's already so weak by then, like there's so much chronic inflammation at that point that it's
could be part of it, and the chemo only makes that worse.
Yeah.
And the worst part of it is that one of the things we've learned about in the last 50 years about cancer is that within a tumor, there's a hierarchy of danger. So you have a lot of cells that are not all that dangerous, and then you've got the ringleaders or the generals of the cancer army, and they're very dangerous, and those are called cancer stem cells. And the chemotherapy barely touches the cancer stem cells. So since more and more scientists are realizing that the main target for their treatments have to be the cancer stem cells, the source of metastasis, the source of recurrence in cancer and invasiveness, chemo doesn't really touch that. And so one of the big developments in cancer over the past few decades has been the development of targeted drugs. So there was a turning point, and it has to do also with the Human Genome Project, with the ability to analyze both normal cells and cancer cells down to the individual links in terms of the DNA. And by being able to do that, you then can see more fully what the mutations are within the cancer and each individual's cancer, because it's now down to, I forget how much, but like $1,000 to sequence a person's DNA, or at least the most relevant what are considered the most relevant portions of the DNA. And then you can target the therapy for the particular mutations that the person has. So this is targeted therapy, and it was coming in slowly in a way, even with the use of tamoxifen for breast cancer and of DES for prostate cancer. But after the decoding of the DNA of the human genome and the creation of high very efficient ways of and inexpensive ways of analyzing a person's own individual DNA, which started around 2011, you had a very big breakthrough, and you were able to then look at the particular person's cancer. And this is why we have, like, at the present time, almost all the drugs being approved by FDA are targeted drugs or immunodrugs, which are a kind of targeted drug. There's very little activity in the field of chemotherapy per se. It's almost a defunct thing. Not that it's defunct in terms of the patient, it isn't, but in terms of research. And if what really matters, you look at the pipeline of the drug companies, and the pipeline of future coming agents is all made up of targeted drugs and immunodrugs.
So what's happening on the immune system side?
So there's been a big revolution in immunotherapy starting in 2011, again, an important year, because the FDA approved a drug called Yervoy. Ipilimumab was the generic name for treating melanoma at that time. So this broke about 100 years of a blockade of immune therapy for cancer. Immune therapy for cancer, I have a film that I did with my grandson Jacob and my son Ben called Immunotherapy, The Battle Within. It's at our website, mossreports.com, for free. It's also on YouTube. And so we trace there the whole history of the immune approach to cancer, because I don't think you can understand this without understanding the history. And the history was that in the 1890s, there was a man named William B. Coley, who was the chief bone surgeon at Memorial Sloan Kettering, my former employer, and was also, by the way, a friend of Dr. Sugiura's, an older colleague of Dr. Sugiura's from the 20s and 30s. So there was a link there. And Coley, in a very rapid series of events, learned that a spontaneous occurrence of a skin infection called erysipelas could result in a cure for cancer. In other words, he found a person who had a 4-time recurrence of head and neck cancer, and in the hospital developed a raging infection of erysipelas. It's streptococcal infection that can in fact be fatal. And instead of dying, he recovered from the erysipelas, and at the same time, the cancer went away. Now, that was a shocking discovery to everybody. He found the man going door to door in tenements in Lower Manhattan. He was a German refugee named Mr. Stein, and he found him and brought him back to his boss in the hospital, Dr. Bull, and they examined this guy, one up one side, down the other. There was no sign of any cancer 7 years after his initial bout with cancer, his four bouts with cancer. So this was a kind of amazing discovery. He didn't know that this same discovery had been made in Germany in the 1860s. It was a pretty well-known thing in Europe. He didn't know about this, we think. There's no evidence, no indication. And if he had known about it, he would have credited them. But in any case, he rediscovered this. But where he took it one step further, he had the idea to kill he tried to use live bacteria. That was too dangerous, and some of the nurses were getting infected. And so he then switched to killed bacteria. So he got a very skilled laboratory scientist who figured this out and made up the best preparation. Martha Tracy was her name. And she was at Cornell Medical School. And then they added another microbe to it, Serratia marquescens. And these two together had this fabulous effect on the immune system, although they never called it the immune system because they didn't make that connection, or he didn't want to make that claim because he didn't have evidence for it. But basically, it was considered fever therapy or bacterial therapy. A lot of people thought that cancer was caused by bacteria, and now you're using one bacteria to defeat another one. There were different theories about why this worked, but the fact is it did work. And many people were cured of advanced cancers at Memorial Sloan Kettering before, way before radiation was discovered, way before, certainly before chemotherapy was discovered. They were curing some cancers at Memorial Hospital, what's now Memorial Sloan Kettering, by using fever therapy / bacterial, mixed bacterial vaccine. And it was especially effective when Martha Tracy was on the scene. But unfortunately, she got a job as the head of a women's medical school in Philadelphia, which she had graduated from. And she left New York and went back to Philly. And nobody really took her place in terms of the quality of the product that was being used. And in fact, one drug company produced a product called Coley's toxins that had 0% effectiveness to it. It probably had zero bacteria in it, but they could put their name Coley's toxin on it, which is the bane of every natural product before and since. That you can call something reishi mushroom, but nobody's going to hold your feet to the fire to make sure that your reishi mushroom is in fact contains any reishi mushroom. And oftentimes it doesn't, by the way. So Coley then went on promoting his or publicizing his treatment. I don't want to say promoting because it was a money loser for him, not a money maker. But he went on experimenting with it and using it. But actually, after about 1910, 1912, it wasn't very effective anymore because the products were not any good anymore. And so when people came to try to replicate his work, oftentimes they couldn't get any results. The British in particular, who were still very powerful in the medical field, had no success with it at all. And so it kind of went out of favor. And there were some people who thought he was a fraud, but he was not a fraud. He was a genius. And he was a person of very high position. He was a director of the hospital. He was considered one of the 4 best bone surgeons in America. He had all kinds of honors and degrees and everything else, but he couldn't really get anywhere with his treatment. Plus, it was a sideline for him. He couldn't make a living by doing this. There were no grants to apply. He did have some support from the Rockefeller family and the well, I don't think officially from the Rockefeller Foundation, but he had a close connection, personal connection to John D. Rockefeller Jr. But that didn't save it because basically I think that the formula stopped working in a lot of cases after about 1910, 1912. Not completely. There were still some successes, but nothing like the brilliant course they were on from about 1893 up until about 1910. But it happened. It happened, and nobody believed it after a while. And radiation came along, and chemo came along, and then the institute, Sloan Kettering Institute, was founded, and it was dominated by chemotherapists. And they hated Coley, and they hated what he stood for. Now, they hated every natural treatment that you could think of, and they thought chemo was going to be, sweep the world, and which it did in a way, but not in a good sense.
Why did they hate it? Because it wasn't what they knew?
Yeah, in part, but it was also the era of better things through chemistry, better things for better living through chemistry. There was just this pervasive view that everything, natural herbs, natural products, everything like that had been swept aside after World War II. We were going to sort of reinvent the world anew on the basis of scientific medicine and chemotherapy and things like that.
So
And
basically synthetic chemical medicine.
correct. Yeah, that they were, and they were, deeply tied. I mean, a lot of these people, the first chemotherapy people, came out of the poison gas program of the US Army, as well as the British and the Germans, their poison gas programs. And there's a deep
Does this have to
connection.
do with Rockefeller too investing in the chemical industry or no?
Nothing at all, because the Rockefellers actually played a very positive role in this whole story, and have played a positive role, because the Rockefeller, it was really John D. Rockefeller Jr., his girlfriend died of sarcoma. And that's what got Coley to, at Rockefeller's request, to see whether anybody had ever been cured of that kind of sarcoma. And that's how he found Mrs. Stein. And that kept on. The reason for the Rockefellers' interest is a very personal one, because of that scarring experience that John D. Jr. had as a young man with this person that he loved, and she dying of, weirdly, of sarcoma as a young lady. And then he gave the land that Memorial Sloan Kettering stands on to this day, was donated by them. And they've also donated about $25 million to the complementary medicine department, to found the complementary medicine department at Sloan Kettering. So, and there's a continuous presence of Rockefellers on the board, but it's, to my view, it's only been a very positive one.
Awesome.
Yeah, but anyway, that's where immunotherapy came from. Now it languished, and the only ones, there was a small cadre of people around the world who continued to work on immunotherapy, realized a lot of it because they knew about Coley, or maybe they knew Coley. And the most important of those people were Coley's daughter, Helen Coley Nautz, and Lloyd Old. And Lloyd Old was vice president of Sloan Kettering when I was there. And the two of them sort of established this field. When Lloyd Old died, his successor was James P. Allison, who won the Nobel Prize 2 or 3 years ago for his discovery of the immune checkpoint inhibitors, Yervoy, Opdivo, Keytruda, and so forth. So that's how immunotherapy actually came. I call that from the quack list to the Nobel Prize, because when I entered the field in '74, Coley's was on an official quack list of the American Cancer Society. It was banned, basically. So it went from that to the Nobel Prize over the course of a career lifetime. And Allison basically then inherited the mantle, if you will, of William B. Coley. And now the 3 of the 6 best-selling drugs in the world are immune therapy drugs. So immunotherapy is now, there's no more debate. Immune therapy is the 4th modality in cancer. A lot of people thought they had the 4th modality, and it was constantly being talked about what's going to be the 4th modality. But the 4th modality turned out to be immunotherapy. The difference is, though, that the Coley's toxins were basically a non-toxic treatment. In this, even it's ironic because they called it toxins, but the toxins is what you call a byproduct of a bacteria. The toxicity of Coley's toxins is fever and chills. The toxicity of the immune checkpoint drugs requires a 50-page article to describe, just to outline all the things that can go wrong with modern day medical immune checkpoint therapy. And a lot of doctors won't give it because they know too well that you can start giving that treatment and all kinds of unexpected and unmanageable things can happen to people. And of course, they minimize these effects, and these drugs have been fantastic bestsellers, partially because they charge $150,000 per patient. To give an entire course of Coley's toxin, you can produce the toxins in a good laboratory for about $1,500. To give the immunotherapy, the modern day immunotherapy is $150,000 So it's 100, I think my math is right, 100 times priced, 100 times more expensive. I would suspect that 95% of that is markup. We know with other immune drugs like Kymriah, which is a kind of CAR T-cell therapy, we know that the price is marked up 95%. The actual cost of producing it, according to the man who invented the treatment, is 1/20th of what they're charging. So it's become this incredible bonanza, and that leads in that. So I wrote, by the way, I just want to say I wrote a book about the Laetrile experience called Doctored Results. I made a film about the immunotherapy, the battle within. But my latest project is my book, Cancer Incorporated. So this leads to the discussion of Cancer Incorporated, because we are just being subjected to the most unbelievable price gouging when it comes to cancer drugs. And there's barely a cancer drug that has appeared in the last few years priced under $150,000 per patient per year. So this is something new, because you used to be able to treat colon cancer for $500. It wasn't terribly effective, but it wasn't that much less effective than what we've got now. Now it's like into the hundreds of thousands. And if you really apply immunotherapy full bore, it's going to probably run to $1 million or $1.5 million before you're done. Now, the results with melanoma are very good. And there are some people who are cured of stage 4 melanoma by the use of immunotherapy. I mean, melanoma has always been the poster child for immunotherapy, by the way. But for most kinds of cancers, the checkpoint inhibitors have just become another desperate thing you do at the time that, you know, the person no longer has any other options. It's working its way into the overall recommendations for cancer, but there are major problems with the way that it's given. And one of those is that it's just too toxic for most people to stand. It's too expensive. The doses are too high, because the companies get paid by the amount of drug that they sell, not the number of people they treat. So if you can, and they use the trickiest ways, like for instance, they got a law passed, you couldn't use the same vial, same bottle for more than one patient. So the doctors wind up throwing out millions of dollars worth of drugs, because the law said, no, you have to throw away the vial for each patient. So they're throwing away vials that are only partially used or partially filled. So that's one of the little tricky ways they have of increasing the profits. But basically, if you can get people to prescribe, to recommend a high dose, let's say if you wanted to give a third of a dose, it would be just as effective. But if you recommend 3 times that dose, not only do you get more side effects, you don't get more effectiveness, but you now made 3 times as much money. And Keytruda, which is the best, I think it's still the best selling of all the immune drugs, a couple of years ago, the sales on that was $8.8 billion. So now the company has a choice, right? If it's selling $9 billion worth of Keytruda, but it knows that 1/3 dose would be just as effective, they have a choice. They could either make 3 billion or they could make 9 billion. Which one do you think they're going to choose?
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, well, why would the oncologist go along with this? And this is the key really to Cancer Incorporated. They could never get away. The drug companies by themselves could never get away with this without the compliance and the collusion of the oncologist. Well, that's not just the oncologist down the block at the local strip mall. We're talking about the key opinion leaders, the KOLs, the key opinion leaders who are in any profession, are the people whose opinions basically drive or suggest or determine the opinions of the rest of the followers in the field. And the drug companies have bought the key opinion leaders. I'm sure this is not really a shock to anybody. What's shocking is that as part of Obamacare, it slipped in this provision that every drug company had to reveal to the penny how much money they were giving to all American doctors. That data is available online, open data. I have the references to it in my book, Cancer Incorporated. So when you cross-reference, which is what I was doing, all this time last year, you look at a study that recommends, comes up with a positive result, supposedly in a drug, and recommends a certain high dose of the drug, and then look at the first author, the second author, and the last author. The last author, lay people don't know this, but the last author is usually the most powerful person. You could have 100 authors in a paper, but you want to always look for the last author in the paper. That's the senior person. That person doesn't need the credit, you see, of being the first or the second author. They can bestow that position on a favorite member of their team to build up that person, their heir apparent, or whatever you want to call them. But when you look at the key people, the KOLs, the key opinion leaders, it's almost invariable that those people are taking money from big pharma, from one or more of the 9 companies that dominate the cancer field. Usually they're taking money from the very company whose product they're then touting. And when I say touting, it's not done like a super salesman. It's done very subtly, or rather subtly, by always putting forward the seemingly positive side of the result and downplaying the negative, or downplaying the side effects, and sometimes by just straight out misrepresenting. And Jose Baselga, who I think died this past year, but he was the physician in chief at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is top position, and he got investigated by the New York Times and by ProPublica, and they found that he had taken a very large sum of money. I'm forgetting now whether it was 1.7 million or 3 million. I think it was 3 million. He had gotten $3 million in the past few years from different drug companies, especially the ones whose products he was supposedly objectively investigating and touting. He was so gung-ho that what really led to his demise at Sloan Kettering was that he continued to go on making positive statements about these drugs, even when the drug company had announced that they were abandoning the whole project because it was totally ineffective. So this guy, he didn't get the memo. He didn't get the memo. And he was going on, like in the New York Times and elsewhere, about the wonders of the drug and how great the results were. And the company had pulled the plug on the whole thing. So this raised people's suspicion. But in a way, those exceptional exposés are a way of absolving the rest of the field, because this is very pervasive. This is really the key to everything, is the bribery of, and if we knew this, I mean, you suspect that this goes on in a lot of fields, right? But you don't really suspect that the oncologists are that corrupt. And the average oncologist isn't, but whether they would take the money if it was available or not is another story. The drug companies, by charging these fantastic amounts of money, there's one drug that's $475,000 per injection. $475,000. Well, they know that, not many people have that money. It's just what it is a way of bilking the public, because the Medicare will pay,
Yep.
and the insurance companies will pay. And if they don't pay, they will have a picket line outside their headquarters of supposed quote unquote cancer patients who are, it's called astroturfing, fake groups of consumers and
Who are what?
patients.
Who are the lackeys of the pharmaceutical companies?
Absolutely. These groups are created by the pharma, some of them, not all.
So I was reading like a report from the World Health Organization last year about how cancer is now falling under the category of chronic inflammation. Disease is a chronic inflammation.
Yeah.
And it's something that I don't hear much about. And it's, I mean, at least from I didn't hear much about it with COVID. I don't hear much about it with cancer of like, well, why aren't oncologists trying to reduce chronic inflammation? I mean, I have 2 family members that have gone through cancer treatment in the last year or the last 2 years, and neither of their oncologists talked about any sort of diet, lifestyle components of inflammation.
Or anything else. Because they're completely focused on drugs, and they get their marching orders from above. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network basically tells them what protocols they can use. And I heard from an oncologist the other day that he wasn't talking about himself, but about colleagues of his who fax the diagnosis to, when they know what your insurance is, they fax the diagnosis to the insurance company, and back comes the fax telling them what drugs they can use or cannot use. So in other words, there's the prescription. It's coming from the pharmaceutical, from the insurance company and that's it. And then they say, okay, and they hand that over to the nurse and give her this. And sometimes it's very simple. Everybody seems to get the same protocol. Breast cancer, CA plus T. You could do this in your sleep.
Yeah. So, I mean, as far as someone who's in oncology and went into it for all the right reasons, are they just trapped? They're just trapped in the system entirely and give up?
I think a lot are, because first of all, it's a fortune to go to medical school. So you come out of it with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And, the average pay of an oncologist a few years ago was $353,000. So that gives you enough money to probably pay off your debt in 10 years or whatever and have a decent lifestyle. But you can't do that if you go against the grain. Right. And going against the grain means, why are you giving a probiotic to somebody when you're giving, treatment to? What do you know that we don't know? In other words, that's and everybody's working now. The oncologists have more or less been gobbled up by a few big firms and hospital groups and so forth. It isn't what it was 30, 40 years ago, where
they're not independent, is what you're saying.
No.
They're part of a conglomerate system.
Absolutely. And where I live, everything was just in a period of a few years, just gobbled up by some group that nobody had ever heard of before. And this is happening all over the country, all over the US, that, like a big hospital like Memorial Sloan Kettering now has branch in Connecticut and a branch in Long Island and 3 in New Jersey. And, there's a competition. They'll be fighting it out with Columbia Presbyterian and so on and so forth. But the day of the independent oncologist is gone. And part of the sign of that is that how you make your 353,000 or more, is by prescribing these drugs. I mean, and doing the other things, of course. But the protocols, the drug protocols, are all written down. They're actually open for the public to see, if the public could interpret the language of it. And there are also lay versions of it, but they don't get into the nitty gritty. The real dirty secret of oncology is that the drugs don't work. That's the real dirty secret. When I say don't work, what does a person, an average cancer patient, an average person think of as working? They probably never, until they suddenly found that they or a loved one had cancer, they probably never gave a thought to that. But if you think about it logically, the things you would want to have out of a drug would be cure. That would be first, of course, the best, first and best thing. Actual life, meaningful life extension. That would be the third thing, second thing. And improved or at least maintained quality of life. That would be the third thing. But those things are almost never measured in clinical trials. Quality of life is never measured. Cure is extremely elusive, extremely elusive. It's not in stage 4 cancer, not often seen. But we all pray for miracles. So it can happen. There are always that small percentage of people who do come away with a cure. But mostly what people are looking for would be a meaningful improvement in quality of life with a maintained or improved, a meaningful increase in lifespan with a maintained or improved quality of life. You expect to get 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years out of the drug, and you don't want to suffer from the drug to such an extent that you'd rather frankly be dead. I mean, it's a,
we've all seen it. I think we've all seen people.
We've all seen it. Every family eventually goes through this. So the dirty secret of oncology is that most of these drugs, half of them, are never shown to increase lifespan. At least they're approved. It's called accelerated approval. They're approved before they ever have any evidence of increased lifespan. And in the good companies, the ones that are ethical, the ones that are, that want to play by the rules, they'll go back and they'll do a study on lifespan. Sometimes it shows up that it doesn't improve anything in terms of lifespan. And if the FDA was doing its job, it would ban those drugs at that point, or at least ban them from those indications, right? They have done that a couple of times, by the way, in the last year. They have gone, in the new administration, they've gone back and pulled approvals for some ineffective drugs. But by and large, up until now, FDA has just left those people alone, left those drugs alone, and they continue to sell them, even though there's no evidence no evidence provided that they increase survival. But when they do increase survival, the actual benefit, on average, in cancer drugs is between 2 and 3 months. That's it. And as I said, the side effects from this can be devastatingly bad, devastating. And the targeted drugs are not targeted enough in many cases that they don't cause side effects. And the immunotherapy is so notorious for the side effects, especially if you give 2 of these immunotherapy drugs at the same time, that huge articles, 50-page articles, have to be written just to describe what's possible with these drugs. So that's the true picture. How do they get away with that? Because they're bribed, because the leadership is bribed. And this is, I'm not going to solve this problem. The only people who are going to solve it are public awareness of what's going on, then coming down to the average oncologist to show them what's really happening. Because there are some really good oncologists, I mean, not just good, skillful, but ethical people out there. There are people who are trying to blow the whistle on this. I'm not alone by any means. And some of them are medical oncologists or different kinds of doctors dealing with cancer. Some of them are even at Memorial Sloan Kettering, but they haven't gotten anywhere. The money is too great. And they get shut down, or they'll appoint a commission or something. But until the oncologists as a whole decree and enforce that there can be no money, personal money, going to individuals into their pockets from these big drug or any other drug companies, you're not going to see any improvement in this. It's corrupt.
So for the typical person that wants to prevent cancer, what do you recommend?
Well, I mean, prevent in the sense of primary prevention, or if you've already had cancer. I mean, I think, you need to, first of all, eat organic. That would be my first recommendation. Try, if you can, to live a healthy lifestyle, exercise, or at least, depending on your age and your ability, good activity, relaxation, um, maintain the gut microbiome. Don't take antibiotics if you can possibly avoid it. You don't necessarily have to take probiotics, but you do need to eat fermented foods that can, of a wide variety, because the microbes that are associated with increased survival are not really able to be made into supplements.
Mhm.
They're
Yep.
anaerobes, or they exist. They're kind of strange, like Akkermansia. You can't make a supplement, and believe me, they're trying it, Dannon and other places, to do this.
Yeah.
They're not coming up with success. So how do you get those microbes? My advice is you shop the perimeter of the supermarket or the health food store. You get homemade products, or products coming from small companies making yogurts, making sauerkrauts,
Like a
especially.
small batch live fermented food.
Correct. And from different sources.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
want everybody's germs. I don't want just a few, just
Yeah.
just a few. I want to sample the
What I'm
entire.
hearing in what you're saying is
Yeah.
if someone has a really healthy, robust microbiome,
Mhm.
that's going to be their key prevention.
Huge. It's huge.
Huge. And is that because of the genetic diversity in the microbiome? If you have a more genetically diverse microbiome?
Well, I don't know about genetic diversity. I haven't explored that. It's just the different species. We
Yeah.
need biodiversity in
Yeah.
our bodies, in our
Right.
society as well, in our
Yeah.
nature. So it's a principle, a natural principle. But in terms of what we could do, that's certainly a very big one. And by the way,
Do you believe oncologists should be talking about this with their patients?
oh,
Or is
absolutely,
and it should be
absolutely.
in medical schools, and if anyone's going.
Absolutely. But the weird thing is that, there's a classic textbook of cancer called the DeVita textbook. And the chapter on the microbiome, the gut microbiome, was moved up to position number 7 out of maybe 100 chapters. They moved this up to extremely prominent position, as if screaming out to their fellow oncologists, look at this.
Mhm.
This is really important.
Mhm.
And I talk to cancer patients all the time, every day practically. I've yet to meet a patient whose oncologist told them, by the way, make sure that you take the microbiomes, or we're going to try to, every way we can, avoid antibiotic use. We're still back in the 50s as far as this, in terms of what actually happens to the typical person. Yes, you may go to a holistic doctor who will tell you these things, but the average person doesn't have the money to go out of network and go to that person, and they're still getting no advice. And then and also I believe that we have to keep ingesting the nutraceutical or the phytochemicals, you call them, that are part of our long-term inheritance. I believe that these plants, I think we co-evolved with them.
Yeah.
We were eating roots and all kinds of things, and a lot of that was encapsulated in traditional Asian medicine. So that's traditional Chinese, but we also neglect the
And Ayurveda.
Ayurveda,
Tibetan, like
Kampo in Japan, and traditional Thai these cultures, they're not as disconnected from nature as the Western cultures are. In general, there's sort of been a disconnect.
Well, and it even seems like the US is the hyperbole of it all, even more so than Europe.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a largely synthetic culture here. But these things are very, very important. It's turning out that only the natural agents can actually control cancer stem cells, which control the growth of the cancer. So I would say,
Say more
curcumin,
about that.
turmeric,
Mhm.
the things that matter,
Mhm.
grape skins, grape seeds, soy, if your system tolerates it. Not everybody's does, because there are enzyme inhibitors in beans, and so including soy. But soy is very, very important, very central to Asian cooking. A lot of this is about the cooking.
Well, and
Uh,
it's fermented in Asian cooking too, so it's not
Absolutely.
taken at. Yeah.
Right. So broccoli, sulforaphane, turmeric, curry powder, which has fenugreek, which has turmeric root, cumin,
Ginger, right, which helps activate the
gin,
turmeric.
ginger, cardamom.
Mhm.
So, and these things go back at least 3,000 years in
Mhm.
Indian cooking, and probably 30,000 years.
Yep.
And our bodies, I think, expected these things in our
Yep.
system. And that's what controlled cancer, because cancer is largely a modern disease,
Yeah.
largely a disease of so-called civilization. So
Yeah.
I think we have to use those things. I'm not a strict vegetarian. I think there's a lot of exaggeration in terms of the danger of meat, and in terms of cancer. I'm not going to talk about anything else, as well as with dairy, but we have to get those vegetables and those nutrients into us somehow. The other alternative is to take supplements of them, but that's a personal choice. I'm not
And
against
not
it.
as effective. I mean, it's not what the body's used to having, and we're used to.
But
we're
the
used to
problem
taste
is,
food.
that once you have cancer,
Yeah.
you need a big jolt of
Yeah.
these things.
Yeah.
And you won't get that through food,
Right.
because you'd have to eat, the curcumin is only 5 or 6% of the turmeric root.
Right.
So you have to, some of these things you have to resort to supplements. But you asked about prevention.
Yeah.
So, and then over and above everything else is having a very, very good positive attitude and a good personal life. And that's, of course, we all struggle with, but that's key in a way. That's going to sort of help determine a lot of these other things.
Mhm. Well, I'm so glad we had a chance to get you
Same
on the
here.
show and get
Thank
your
you, Kate.
story out. And yeah, absolutely, my pleasure.
Okay,
Yeah, Ralph
great
Moss.
talking to you.
And just everyone, Ralph Moss, his website is mossreports.com. There's a ton of information there, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you.